All right, hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. So yeah, my name is Brad. I'm an employee at Google. I manage the Angular team. And I'm doing something I think you're not supposed to do. I'm actually giving 2 talks in one. I know it says up there, Angular and Effective Teams. That's the 2 talks. I hope you enjoy it. So I want to start off with a little story about how I started in tech, where when I was growing up, my idol, like maybe some of you, was Steve Jobs. And kind of in a very Forrest Gump sort of way, I ended up working at this company called Next Computer. And Next was the company Steve started after he left Apple, before he went back to Apple. And here we are. Here's me in the back with that flock of seagulls sort of haircut. And you know, Steve right down there in front. I actually remember that first day. Actually, it was the day before the first day that I started. And it was at a meeting with maybe 200 people in the room. Steve looks out across everybody, and he looks right at me, and he says, who are you? And then he says to me something else, which is related to the second part of my talk, and we'll get into that later. But first, I want to talk just a little bit about where we are in Angular and some fun things that we're going to be doing for the rest of the year that I think we can all get excited about. So one of the things I'm super happy about is all of you and how many folks are coming to be part of the Angular community. And we've grown tremendously here in 2017 and into 2018, where just even over the holiday months, we grew a bunch, and we just passed 1 million developers in the Angular community. Woohoo, yeah. It's fantastic, and it's actually kind of even better than that, because if you are part of the AngularJS community, if we track how fast we grew from AngularJS version 1 to when it reached 1 million users, and tracking Angular, which was version 2, to when we reached 1 million users, it's actually growing 5 times faster than Angular 1 did. It's a pretty incredible thing. Thank you so much for being part of that. And we see the same sort of growth in your local areas, where if you want to find other developers like you who get together on a monthly basis, you can go to angular.meetup.com and probably find something in your neck of the woods where you can go continue events like this, help each other learn, explore Angular content. So on to some exciting things. We've got a really big roadmap planned for 2018. I just want to focus on a couple of these things. Number one, we're working on a build system, or actually bringing a build system that we've been using at Google for over a decade called Bazel. And Bazel's this thing. You can go to their site at bazel.build. You can learn all about it. But I want to focus on a couple things and what it might be like for you to use it. In terms of benefits, it's got this really nice environment where the builds are all hermetic, which means that you get fully incremental builds every time, and it never redoes work that it's already done. So if you've built part of your application for tests, it reuses that when you're running some other part. You never have to redo something that's already been done. As far as scaling, you can really move to any size team and any size code base, and you're going to get a consistent build speed on rebuilds, because it's always incremental. You never have to wait for a full rebuild. It never gets confused. Cool. You can have multiple repos that share code, or one giant model repo as we do at Google. Another very interesting or cool thing about it is that it supports multiple languages. If I've got a backend that I'm doing in Java or Go or C++ or C# or whatever, I can compile that in the same way that I do TypeScript, JavaScript, and my front-end bits. And then if there's other things that I want to bring into Bazel, there's a Python-like extension language and a really good set of community-contributed extensions that you can go be a part of. So if you go to their site, you see a bunch of nice logos about people who are working on this, Dropbox and Stripe and Pinterest. But there's another team that's started to use Bazel recently I wanted to highlight, which is Angular. We've recently moved from a crazy collection of build scripts onto Bazel, and the team is fairly ecstatic about it. And so just to be clear, yes, it's from Google, but we're doing this because we think it's something that can help make you all more productive. We don't actually have a horse in the race. Mishko's ecstatic. Mishko's the guy who started Angular with me like almost 10 years ago. Like the fact that it never redoes work, very cool. You never have to wait around. Rob Wormold's been practicing with it, not on building Angular itself, but on building Angular projects, building applications like you would, and feels tremendously more productive just because he doesn't have to wait around for the rebuilds. So where we are right now, it's still pretty early, but there's some companies trying it out. You get this very fast round-trip development cycle, and our sort of service level goal is that you always get under 2 seconds as your experience. We've recently released bundling with Rollup and Uglify, and you have the ability to reuse libraries across many different applications. So if you've got a big application or a big set of applications at your company, this might be something you might want to look into. A couple things that if you need them, you probably want to wait. One is if you need packaging for libraries, if you need to roll out a library to other folks that you're not going to be compiling from source, this is something that's coming soon, as is code splitting and lazy loading. So a couple things that are going to be coming in the next couple months you might want to hang out for. But if you are interested, Alex Eagle and the rest of the folks working on it would love for you to come and check it out. There's a bunch of links in my presentation like this one. I'm going to tweet out the whole deck right after this, so you can just follow me on Twitter, Bradley Green, and you can get all of the stuff that's in here, so no reason to write it down. Schematics. Okay, so Schematics is the engine inside the Angular CLI. And most folks use the CLI, but even if you don't, you might be able to use Schematics at your company. And so you probably know the CLI, where you can use it to scaffold new applications, add components, help you build, and then have this really nice productive development cycle based on it. Well, Schematics is the part that we've extracted that powers all of this for the way we describe our templates. And now you can take those defaults and use them out of the box. You can extend them, you can replace or add to them, or you can actually completely replace them to do something that's very specific to your application or your company. But it's more than just the templates, and we've recently, in the beta of the CLI 1.7, we have this new command, ngUpdate, which will automatically update all of your dependencies on NPM, and then refactor your code for any of the breaking changes that we can take care of, so you can always be on that latest release. You can look at this as an example, but there's some other things you might want to do as sort of exercises left to you folks. You might want to do something like, hey, I'd like to build a schematic that would automatically change all my routes to lazy loaded routes. You could have it replace all of your buttons with Angular material buttons. You can probably come up with more examples. And there's some other companies that are already building on schematics. So at Narwhal, they're using this to help build NX. NX gets your team set up with all of the right infrastructure so that you can scale quickly and never have to worry about which decisions you've made. And the folks at NativeScript, or at Progress on NativeScript, are using it to help build bridges between existing Angular projects and mobile projects for iOS and Android, so that you can easily extend those and share code across the two. Hot off the presses, last night on the Angular blog, you can check this out. Schematics, Hans just published a tutorial. You can go read up on how you can start building your own schematics. All right, the Component Developers Kit. This is part of what we do in building components. And at Google, we have a design aesthetic that we call material design, which is great, and a lot of folks out in the open source community use it. You may want to use it yourself, or even if you don't, we've extracted all of the pieces that we use to build the CDK, or to build the material design components, into this thing called the Component Developers Kit. And it contains all kinds of goodness, like accessibility, BiDi, layout, and we're coming out with a bunch of new pieces to it as well, SVG, tree, overlay, etc., so that you can use these as the blocks for building your own components. So whether you use material design or not, these are intended to be sort of a scaffolding so you can quickly build components in your own company. You'll notice that it has things that are maybe just hard to get right if you try to do it yourself, like accessibility, scrolling, overlay. And then it has what I'd call unopinionated components, things that don't have a look and feel associated with them, that you could use to build whatever version you wanted. So if you wanted to build the highest performant, most integrated with Angular table, you could use the default table infrastructure inside the CDK to build your own. Again, on the Angular blog, last week, Jeremy published a nice overview of the CDK and how to get started, you can go check it out at blog.angular.io. All right, observables. How many folks here use observables in their code? Yeah, actually, if you're an Angular user, that was a trick question. You're already using observables, so thanks very much. So whether you use just like the default APIs and say the router in Angular or RxJS or NGRX, you're using observables. So this is a cool thing that we've been working with the Chrome team, folks at Netflix, and a bunch of other folks in the open source community to bring to the browsers as a standard. And the goals are a couple. So one, we really want to unify the APIs across all of the different libraries so that we can ship less code to the browser and write less code doing sort of impedance matching between the observables API and what's in the DOM. And so it's intended to be useful out of the box. When you use the browser, you should be able to rely on some of the reducers that you're used to and hopefully know and love, like map filter, take until. And it's going to be integrated with the DOM event APIs, so you could do something like image on load, subscribe, and get the event, and interact with it in the same way that you do any other observable in the environment, which I think is pretty cool. So there's a spec out there that you can go read, and there's been some really good discussion with community members and browser developers on all of this. But in some ways, this is a validation process and a popularity contest of sorts. So there's a couple things you could do to help. So number one is go out to GitHub, click on the link in my presentation, star and watch the issue so that folks know that you think it's interesting. And if you know folks on some of the development teams on maybe Edge or Safari or Firefox, reach out and explain that, hey, this would be good for the whole environment. We think it's a pretty good idea. Chrome's all bought in. We're going to build a default implementation so we can try it out. But it would actually be very helpful to reach out and tell other browser developers what you think. Angular elements. So this is, I think, a really interesting and sort of far-reaching technology that we're working on inside Google. And it's meant so that you can take your components that you build in Angular and just publish them as custom elements. And if you're not familiar with what custom elements are, they're part of the web component specification. It's a default standard that comes with your browser. And it has a bunch of different pieces, but the part that we care about most is custom elements. So the idea here is that the browser comes with a bunch of different default elements like inputs and checkboxes and forms and whatnot. Wouldn't it be nice if I could create something myself that looked like those default elements? And that's what custom elements are. So in Angular elements, what we let you do is take an existing Angular component and just publish it as a custom element. Or another way to think about it is you're going to be wrapping your Angular component inside a custom element so that when people go to consume it, all they see is a custom element. They don't have to know anything about Angular. They don't have to interact with any of Angular's APIs. You just load a bit of JavaScript, and all of a sudden you have some new elements show up that you can interact with as you interact with anything else in the DOM. So that's pretty cool. So why would I want to use this? Well, I might be an Angular developer, and I want to publish some of my components or full applications to folks who use any framework or no framework. And we think this is pretty cool. So what this does, again, this allows me to wrap my Angular components as custom elements, and it does that bridging between the Angular APIs with my inputs and outputs and all of the other goodness, and so that I don't have to worry about how to work with custom elements. And then from the other side, anyone consuming it just has to know how to interact with the DOM, which we pretty much all do. The other kind of cool benefit is that you don't have to know anything about Angular. Again, this is going to be bootstrapped by the browser just by loading the piece of JavaScript that contains the Angular elements. To build it, it's very simple. There's just one little bit of new API you'll need to learn, which is this sort of register as custom elements call, where you pass in the name of the component, or the component that we're going to be building, and a module where you've registered that component. If you want to learn more, there's a pretty good talk by Rob Wormold. He's a developer relations guy on the Angular team. Rob maintains a stack blitz with a whole bunch of material design components that have been exposed as custom elements. And then there's a guy named Vincent who has a Medium article that he's been keeping up to date with our progress through Angular elements. You can go check that out as well. So we've gotten through the proof of concept stage. Our next step is that we want to actually use it in Angular.io. And there's a place where we have the sort of content management system where we have static HTML that we want to insert some Angular components. And we think this is really going to simplify life for us. And then we'll get to release. One last thing before I transition to the second talk. We're working on a new renderer for Angular, and we're calling it ngIv. We've done this a couple times in Angular, and when we, like for example, when we moved from Angular 2 to Angular 4, we replaced the renderer. And there we saw Angular go from very large to not so large. And we have some additional goals around Ivy now. One of the main ones is, again, to make that transition from the size we are now to actually very, very small. And so I'm excited about this for a lot of reasons. One is helping us out in the mobile space, making those load times go very, very small. But also with Angular elements. So if I want to distribute some components that I might build, I actually want the framework itself to be tiny so that people wouldn't think twice about loading the components that I've built. We also want to make things simpler. It's actually going to be a lot simpler for us. We'll be able to go faster because the architecture is simpler. It's going to be simpler for you folks as well. If you've debugged Angular applications today, it's a little bit complex to read, to understand stack traces. We want to make this very, very easy. And so ngIv has a very small, easily understood set of rendering instructions that make a lot of sense when you're debugging. In the current compiler, right now it kind of needs to know about the entire application you're building and does sort of a global rebuild. Not exactly, but that's kind of what it does. And so as your application grows, it'll take longer to build. One of the properties that we've built into ngIv is that the compiler only needs to know about a single component and can compile that individually, so that all compiles should be incremental from here on out once we release it. And again, all of this is done in an API-compatible way, so there'll be no changes for you. It's not going to be a breaking change. We're going to bring it in whenever it's ready, but it won't, since it's not a breaking change, we can land it whenever it is ready. Just last week, we got to the state where we could generate Hello World with this new renderer. The next set of work is going to be making sure that everything is API compatible. We're going to test it against hundreds of applications at Google to make sure it's going to work well for all of you, and then we'll get to final release. There's actually a whole bunch more goodness that is going to be coming based on ngIv, but I think this is good enough for now. Okay, thanks so much. And now my second talk. This is a little bit of a different conference, so I thought maybe I could talk about some different things that I'm interested in, and I hope some of you are too. And there's a bunch of things in my head that I conflate maybe inappropriately, but I think it's all right. So hopefully you can follow me along in the way I think about these things. Some caveats here. Diversity and inclusion and team productivity, these are not figured out things. I'm probably wrong about a lot of stuff. So take it with a grain of salt. Also, what I really want to do here is start a conversation with any, and maybe all of you, about how do we do all of this stuff better. For a long time, I've wanted to be involved and help out, in particular with women in tech, but I haven't known what to do. And maybe you're like me, and you're like, I think I should do something, but I'm not sure what. And to talk about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about motivations, like why would we get into this, or why would somebody care about it? And a lot of times there's a personal connection. Either this is important for you personally, or you have a connection with somebody who you care about that this is important for. For me, I've got a 6-year-old daughter, and she is an inventor and an experimenter. And when she enters the workforce, I would actually like the world to be in a much different place than it is today. Once, she really wanted to make roller skates, and I wasn't paying attention that day, and so when I found her, she had carved some nice grooves in the floor with the roller skates that she had invented, some Hot Wheels cars. I was too proud to actually get angry. It was awesome. You might be interested in this because you just think it's the right thing to do from a personal advancement or from sort of an economic standpoint. You might think, well, you know, it's nice if a lot of people are high wage earners and could get into the tech industry. But there's kind of this non-controversial, maybe wimpier aspect of it, which I think is interesting, which is team productivity and how well we can do together, that I want to focus on a little bit today. Hope you can follow me in this. So there's a bunch of different ways that we can support diversity. I want to walk through a couple of them and some things I've tried. Like, one of them is help inspire folks to come join us in the world of tech. And some great ways to do that are conferences like this one. Thank you for everyone who helped put this on. And things like NG Girls, who around the world helps women get into learning Angular. Yeah. You can reach out and support individual people. One of the things that I found really interesting is on LinkedIn, you can actually connect with anyone. And when people connect with me who seem like they've got a different background than I do, I usually reach out and I say, hey, thanks for connecting. Please let me know if I can ever be helpful. And I've ended up meeting a whole bunch of interesting people that way and having some pretty cool conversations. You can also help by getting money for organizations that want to help with diversity. And sometimes, actually, yes, cash is the best way to help things out. And I was actually able to merge two things that I love by writing some books for AngularJS way back when, and having the funds donated, the proceeds donated to the Anita Borg Institute. Now, these books are hecka old, so I think if you want to support Anita Borg, just give them money. Don't buy the books. But for everyone who bought them, thank you so much for being part of that. You can also work on recruiting. You might say, hey, it would be cool if on my team there were some people with different perspectives, different backgrounds who think differently than me. And you can work on that. But to me, I think there's a more important aspect, which is inclusion, because if you inspire and help and recruit people to a place where they don't really feel welcome or they don't feel like they can succeed, it's kind of wasted effort. But I think it's important for some other reasons, and I'll get into that. The assertion that I'm kind of making in my head is that these things are all conflated, that productivity and diversity are very tightly related, productivity and inclusion are tightly related, and they're all kind of bound together in ways that I can't neatly separate. But I think that if we focus on inclusion, we actually get a lot of the properties of the other two, maybe a little bit for free. So to get there, let's talk about, well, maybe what makes for a productive team. And one reasonable assumption I might make is that it's somehow related to the IQs of the people on that team. Because for personal productivity, it's a really good predictor about how well I'll do in an individual task. Well, there's a study I found where they took about 700 participants and they made them go through a bunch of sort of team-based tasks. And you can go check out the link below. I think it's worth a read. But the thing they found was actually no. It's not tightly correlated to the IQs of folks on the team. So then you might say, okay, well then what did matter? One of the things was social sensitivity. How well am I able to look at someone's face or see what they're typing or hear what they're saying and predict how they're feeling and respond appropriately? Another thing was taking turns in conversations. Well, it seems like something we should always do, but if you've been in meetings, you might notice that that doesn't always happen. Some people are very passionate about their point. And another finding was just the number of women. More was better. Now, if you're a woman, you might feel really good about your employment prospects about right now. But guys, don't worry. I'm going to get to the next points. It's fine for us too. It's all good. You might push back on me and say, hey, Brad, I don't know. Like the lines you're drawing may not make sense. There's individual tasks you have to do on your team. Maybe IQ is more important. Maybe those are more important for a job. You might say, well, I don't even know if you can extrapolate that lab-based result into the tech world. These are all fair points. But there was a follow-on study, which I kind of like even better than the first one, because what they found out was the much stronger predictor about how teams do was the average social perceptiveness of the group. And there's a way to measure this called the reading the mind in the eyes test. And we'll get to that in a minute. But there was a couple other interesting findings. One was the more cognitive diversity you have on the team, the more different backgrounds, the more differences in the way people thought, the more innovation you got out, the better folks did on tasks where innovation was required. Conversely, though, the more cognitive similarity you have, the more efficient you are. Like, it was just easier to communicate, easier to get stuff done with people who think like you do. So to me, this kind of says, I kind of want a balance. I kind of want some of both. Guys, this is why it's okay for you to be on teams. There's other reasons too. So what is this reading the mind and the eyes test? So what you do is you go to this website, the link below, and you get presented a set of eyes. And you get 4 choices. You get to say, what type of emotion are these eyes telling me? This is meant to rate, like, how good are you at figuring out how do people feel? For folks who are competitive, I have taken this test. If you go take it, I'll tell you what my score was, but you have to tell me your score first. I want to talk about another set of research that I think is applicable for this. And this is a project that we called Project Oxygen at Google, where we interviewed over 200 folks on over 180 teams with looking at about 250 different attributes, trying to figure out what would make for an effective team. And I love some of the verbiage in this. And like, it kind of went like this. We were really confident we would find some like immediate mix of individual traits that were probably something like a Rhodes Scholar, 2 extroverts, an engineer who rocks at AngularJS, this was back in 2015, and a PhD, and voila. Unfortunately, they were completely wrong. It wasn't any of those things. It didn't matter so much who was on the team, but how they interact with each other. And of all the things that matter, the top one, which I think mirrors some of the research that we've looked at so far, was psychological safety. How much do I feel at ease that I can take risks on a team and that I can be vulnerable about many different things with the colleagues that I have? And so knowing all this, I kind of went through this again, trying to figure out, okay, well, I know all that stuff. What can I do? What should I do about it? I think there's a couple things. So one thing you can do, one thing that might be an interesting conversation to have here and when you go back to your teams and maybe at your local Angular meetups, is to make that social sensitivity and turn-taking in conversations an explicit thing that you do. Let's talk about it, let's write it down, let's highlight this so that it's at the forefront of our awareness so we don't lose track of it, if we know that actually this is critical for having good teams. Might not be obvious, but you actually need to sleep to have a good brain to not be too cranky. Public service announcement. The CDC says that 1 in 3 adults in America don't get enough sleep. Here's the insidious thing about not getting enough sleep. If you're crazy, you don't know you're crazy. And if you're not getting enough sleep, you think you're doing fine because you're not getting enough sleep, but everybody else knows. And there's some research behind this that also says that if you are sleep deprived, you do a worse job of suppressing your negative implicit biases. We all have them, but this is just another kind of complex way of saying you're crankier when you haven't had enough sleep. There's a really good podcast on this if you want to learn a little bit more, on my favorite podcast called You Are Not So Smart. It's episode 110. Definitely go check it out for some things that we can do. Another thing you can do personally, and this is something that I think about a lot, is just become aware of your biases. For me, I grew up in Iowa, literally in a cornfield. And so I didn't have a lot of folks to interact with, and certainly not folks that are different from me. They all pretty much looked like me. If you haven't noticed, I am a white male, and I actually can't have a direct experience that's anything other than that. I can have an indirect experience, and I think that's valuable, but this is something I should be aware of. I may not look like it on stage, but I was, or I still am, an introvert. In high school, I had exactly 2 friends, and I was the third wheel. In college, I had exactly 1 date. I don't know what happened with that. And sometime today, I'm going to go disappear back in my hotel room and hide and recover from all the talking that I do. And one of the ways that I stay aware of my biases is through meditation. This is actually a skill that you can develop to develop another part of your brain so that instead of being sort of carried along by your biases and just reacting, that you can kind of look at yourself and say, oh, here's that emotion that's coming. Maybe I'll do something different about that. There's actually some good research that says that meditation can be one of the ways that you improve your ability to empathize with others and improve your score on the reading the mind in the eyes test. Improv games. These are some skill building exercises where you actually have to read what other people are thinking and feeling and react to them. Here's some pictures of the Angular team I kind of tricked them into doing improv games. They're playing virtual volleyball, where I said, hey, imagine a net, imagine a ball. You actually have to keep score, and they did pretty well. It was kind of fun to watch. If you're interested in this and other ways that you can build this empathic skill, my favorite book is this one whose title I love, which is, If I Understood You, Why Would I Have This Look on My Face? Definitely good. One last thing you can do is, and you're already here for this, listen to April's talk coming up a little bit later this morning on emotional intelligence for engineers. All right. We've got a group of over 1 million folks in the Angular community. I would love this to be one of our central conversations about how we can help, how we can do better, and do something together. So that thing that Steve said to me on my first day at my hero, he said, you can't be here, which technically he was totally right. I wasn't an employee at the company yet. It was the day before I was to be employed. But I kind of wish he had said something else. So the thing I want to say to all of you is you belong here. I'd love you to carry that message to your Angular communities at home and at your local meetups. Thanks so much. Let's have a great conference.